The sun climbed slowly over the jagged cliffs of Rio Blanco, and the desert wind carried the dry taste of sand and sage across the narrow trail. Elena Marlowe rode in her wedding dress along the uneven path, her ivory veil flowing behind her like a ghost in the pale light of morning. Her heart beat with both excitement and unease because today was supposed to be the happiest of her life. Her family had arranged everything carefully. Her groom was wealthy and strong and kind in his own careful way. Every seamstress, every dress fitting, every ride across the town square had been planned. But the desert did not care for plans. The cliffs and canyons watched with quiet indifference, and the stories of the Apache that had been whispered across settlements and towns pressed against her mind like the wind against the horses. Tales of silent warriors appearing from nowhere and disappearing into cliffs had kept many travelers in their homes at night, and many merchants had abandoned their trade along the Rio Blanco for fear of the shadowed hills. Elena had never believed them completely, but as the canyon walls closed in around the wagon, she felt a strange tightening in her chest, a sensation that seemed to warn her of something unseen. The horses shifted nervously, snorting into the dry wind that carried the scent of dust and stone. Their hooves struck against the rocky path, creating echoes that seemed too loud in the quiet canyon. She glanced at the ranch hands riding beside her, their faces pale beneath wide-brimmed hats, hands twitching near pistols, eyes scanning every curve in the path. And then they came. The movement was sudden, silent, and unnatural. 5 figures appeared on the cliffs, sliding down with the ease of creatures born of the stones themselves. The ranch hands reached for their pistols, but before they could fire, one was knocked from his horse by a motion so swift it seemed impossible, and the other was disarmed before he even realized what had happened. Elena barely had time to scream before strong arms lifted her from the wagon and placed her on a dark horse that seemed to appear from the shadow itself. The rider was tall, lean, and his skin carried the hue of the desert sun. His eyes were dark and deep and held a quiet command that froze her blood and made the wind itself seem to pause. A leather cord hung from his neck with an eagle feather swinging gently against his chest. The presence of this man was more powerful than any storm, more commanding than any sheriff or judge she had known. He spoke in English, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of mountains and silence. "No harm," he said calmly. "She comes with me." Elena opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. Her throat tightened, her tongue seemed to stick against her teeth, and the desert stretched endlessly around her as the horse moved forward, swift and sure. She looked back at her father waving desperately from a distance and at the ranch hands, stumbling after him, but the cliff swallowed them. The path rose higher and higher as they climbed into a narrow pass, where the Rio Blanco vanished behind them like a dream fading at dawn. Her veil whipped against the horse, dust and grit stinging her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She tried to reason with herself. This was an abduction, she told herself, a crime that the law would punish, and yet the way the man held her spoke of careful strength, of respect rather than cruelty. Every motion was deliberate and controlled. She realized that even in fear there was a strange safety in his presence, a feeling that she could not name. The desert stretched around them, and the wind carried their silence as if the land itself was holding its breath. Hours passed, and the sun sank lower behind distant cliffs, painting the rocks with fire. Finally, they reached a small clearing surrounded by tall pines where a fire had been built and flickered against the darkness. The man lowered her from the horse and gestured for her to sit, a motion so gentle it contrasted with the raw force that had lifted her. She obeyed silently, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. He remained standing, eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting shadows to rise from the rocks at any moment. Elena sat on the ground, wrapped in her veil, watching him with a mixture of curiosity, caution, and something unnameable stirring in her chest. The desert night stretched long and cold, but the fire kept the shadows at bay and cast a golden warmth across the clearing. She realized this was only the beginning of a journey she could not yet understand, a path that would lead her far from the life she knew. The man spoke quietly now, asking no questions and giving no explanations but tending the fire, bringing water and offering her a blanket of thick wool. She accepted it without a word, feeling the warmth press through her cold skin. She could sense his presence everywhere, a quiet force that did not demand obedience but did not allow disobedience either. He moved silently around the clearing, checking traps, inspecting the surrounding rocks, and occasionally glancing at her with eyes that seemed to pierce through the night and into her soul. She had never met a man like this, a man carved from the solitude of the land itself, shaped by silence and survival. The stars appeared one by one above the high cliffs, and the moon rose pale and watchful, casting long silver shadows across the trail. Elena shivered, and the man stepped closer, offering her a hand to steady herself and a quiet nod to assure her she was safe. And though fear still lingered, a strange sense of anticipation began to grow within her. She did not know the man's name, nor did she know his past or the reasons he had taken her from the Rio Blanco. But she felt the weight of destiny pressing against her, as if the land itself had conspired to bring them together. The wind whispered across the canyon, carrying the scent of pine, dust, and distant water, and Elena felt the first shiver of understanding that her life was about to change forever. This night in the mountains, beneath the endless stars and the silent cliffs, would mark the beginning of a bond neither she nor the warrior had anticipated. One was a bride torn from the path of convention and comfort, the other a man who had walked alone for years, untouched by human affection or companionship. The fire crackled and the shadows danced around them, the land itself watching in quiet judgment. And Elena realized that the long night ahead would reveal truths she had never imagined and awaken desires and fears that had lain dormant in her heart. And though she did not yet know it, the man who had appeared like a ghost from the cliffs was a warrior who had not touched a woman in 10 years. A man shaped by loss and solitude, a man whose silence carried a depth that only the mountains could measure. She settled near the fire and watched him, feeling the heat on her cheeks and the strange, unspoken promise in his gaze. The desert night stretched endlessly around them, the stars shining like witnesses. And Elena Marlowe understood that the journey of the Rio Blanco Trail was only the first chapter in a story that would bind her fate to the mysterious warrior of the cliffs. The mountains loomed around them, jagged and silent, their peaks catching the pale morning light like the edges of broken glass. Elena watched as the warrior moved with a calm precision, gathering firewood and arranging stones in a circle for the fire. Each motion was deliberate, almost ritualistic, and though he had not spoken much since the night they first met, his presence spoke louder than words could ever convey. He was not cruel, though his strength and skill could have made him so. He was a man forged in solitude, a figure carved from the desert and the mountains themselves, a man who carried loss like a heavy cloak across his shoulders. Elena felt the weight of his gaze without him needing to look at her, and it stirred a mixture of fear and fascination within her. She had been taken from the Rio Blanco trail, yet she was beginning to feel the strangeness of safety in his presence. He tended the fire with care, arranging sticks so that the flames would not flare too high, checking the edges of the clearing, and moving as though he expected danger from the wind or the stones themselves. She tried to speak, but her words faltered in the face of his quiet intensity. Finally, he sat opposite her, letting the firelight carve shadows across his sharp features. She could see the lines etched by years of hardship, the hardness of a life lived under constant threat, and yet there was softness in his eyes that spoke of things he had buried long ago. "I have not seen a woman in 10 years, he said at last. His voice deep and measured, carrying the weight of truth and loneliness. Elena's heart skipped, her breath catching in her throat, and she looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and curiosity. 10 years? She whispered, barely audible. Then why me? The warrior did not answer immediately. He picked up a small knife and began sharpening it against a stone, the rhythmic sound echoing across the clearing. Finally, he looked up and met her gaze, his eyes steady and unflinching. "Because the spirits put you on my path," he said quietly. "Because a man can run from life only so long. Because a warrior may die alone, but a man should not." She studied him, trying to understand, and the silence of the mountains seemed to press around them. The wind shifted through the pines, and for a moment she felt the land itself listening to the words he spoke. She realized that this man, who had been alone for a decade, was not only capable of great strength, but also of restraint, discipline, and honor. The night stretched on, and he offered her food, a small portion of dried meat and water, without demanding thanks or acknowledgement. She accepted, feeling the warmth of the fire and the quiet rhythm of his movements as a kind of protection. The mountain air was crisp, carrying scents of pine, stone, and the faint trace of smoke from distant fires. She shivered under the weight of her wedding dress, and he moved silently to place a thick Navajo blanket around her shoulders, draping it without a word, his fingers brushing against hers for only a moment. The contact sent a jolt through her body she could not name. She looked into his eyes and saw not desire, not threat, but a recognition of something beyond fear, a recognition of the life and hope that still existed despite the years of solitude. Elena realized she was witnessing a man shaped by tragedy, a man who had closed himself to the world and yet held a space within him for honor and protection. The fire crackled and the shadows danced around them, and she felt the strange pull of curiosity and admiration mixing with the lingering fear of captivity. She wanted to ask about his life, his past, his tribe, and the reasons he had vanished into the mountains, but the words seemed too small for the vastness of the silence surrounding them. Finally, she asked, "Why me, truly?" He looked away, eyes tracing the ridges of distant cliffs. "Because the spirits told me," he said slowly. "Because you appeared when I no longer thought anything would. Because the land itself reminded me I had not forgotten how to live." His words were soft yet carried a gravity that seemed to echo in the canyon. Elena felt the weight of them pressing into her chest and could not speak. She realized that the man who had taken her from the Rio Blanco trail was not her enemy. He was something far more complex, a man whose life had been stripped bare by loss and survival, and who now stood before her not with threat, but with something she could not name yet felt in the depth of her bones. Night deepened, and the stars appeared above, cold and distant, yet bright. The mountain air grew colder, and she huddled closer to the fire. He moved silently to stoke it, then returned to sit opposite her, keeping watch as if nothing in the world could escape his notice. The silence stretched, but it was not uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding that neither of them needed words to communicate. The wind whispered through the pine needles, carrying with it the scent of the mountains and the faint memory of life outside this secluded world. Elena realized she had been thrust into a place where time itself seemed slower, where the days and nights were measured not by clocks, but by the movement of the sun and the quiet rhythm of the wilderness. And as the firelight flickered across his face, she understood that the man who had not seen a woman in 10 years was no longer a stranger. He was a figure of solitude and survival, a living echo of the mountains themselves, and she felt the first trace of trust forming in her chest. The night was long, but the danger of the desert seemed distant in comparison to the quiet revelation she felt watching him move, speaking only in necessary words, living by instinct and honor. She realized that this man, the warrior of 10 years' silence, was a mystery carved from life itself. And though she did not yet know his name nor fully understand his past, she sensed that their paths had been intertwined by fate. by the spirits, and by the land that stretched unbroken around them. By dawn, the first light touched the peaks, and Elena awoke to the sense of something ancient and enduring. She could hear the warriors stirring, checking the surroundings, preparing them for the day. And though she remained silent, wrapped in the thick blanket he had offered, she felt a shift in her heart, a stirring of curiosity and courage. The warrior had not spoken much, but in the silence of the mountains, in the rhythm of his movements and the steadiness of his gaze, he had spoken more than words ever could. He was a man shaped by loss, solitude, and discipline, yet he carried within him the faintest ember of hope, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And as Elena watched him move through the clearing, a sense of awe and anticipation filled her chest. The journey ahead was uncertain, perilous, and fraught with danger. Yet she knew in that moment that the warrior of 10 years' silence would not harm her. He would protect her, guide her, and perhaps, in the long span of the desert and mountains, awaken something in her heart that she had never known. And though she did not yet understand the depth of her own feelings, she realized that the bond forming between them was more than fear, more than survival. It was the beginning of a story that neither time nor distance could undo. A story that would test them both, challenge their hearts, and ultimately bind them together in a way that even the desert and the cliffs could not separate. The storm came slowly at first, the sky darkening over the peaks like a shadow crawling across the land. Elena had been awake for hours, watching the warrior move silently among the pines, gathering firewood, checking traps, tending the small fire that had become their center of warmth and life in the wilderness. The wind picked up, rattling dry branches and carrying the scent of rain and wet stone. She shivered in her soaked wedding dress, her body cold and her mind restless. The warrior had moved to build a shelter of pine boughs and branches, covering the ground with layers to keep the chill from reaching her bones. He worked with careful precision, each motion deliberate, as though he was shaping not only the shelter but the space around them to protect her. Elena watched him, feeling a strange combination of awe and fear and a tension in her chest that she could not name. He did not speak much, but the quiet rhythm of his movements filled the clearing with a presence that was stronger than words. She wanted to leave, to run, to escape the strange pull she felt toward him. But each attempt to move was stopped by the rough terrain, or the sudden growl of some distant creature that reminded her the mountains did not forgive carelessness. She had tried to flee twice before, stumbling over roots, slipping on rocks, and both times he had appeared silently behind her, his hand steadying her shoulder, his voice calm yet firm. "You should not run," he said simply, and she realized that even in his warning there was no threat, only concern. The storm gathered strength, and rain began to fall in thin sheets, wetting the earth and soaking her hair. She shivered uncontrollably, and he moved to cover her with his own deer-hide cloak, draping it carefully over her shoulders. The weight of it pressed warmth into her body, and she leaned against him without thinking, feeling the first spark of safety and comfort in days. His eyes held hers as he spoke softly, "You should not tremble alone." The words were quiet but firm, carrying a kind of honesty she could not question. She felt the closeness of him, the strength of his body and the steadiness of his hands. And she knew in that moment that the fear she had carried from the Rio Blanco trail was beginning to shift into something else. Something she could not name, but that pulsed in her chest like a drumbeat. The firelight flickered across their faces, the shadows dancing around them as the wind moaned through the trees. Her pulse raced and she could feel the heat from his body against her own. She tried to look away but could not. His hand brushed her cheek gently, wiping away a drop of rain or perhaps a stray tear, and her breath caught at the contact. "You fear me," he murmured, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years of silence. "I don't," she whispered back, barely audible. "I fear what this is becoming." He did not move away. Instead, he leaned closer, his lips hovering just above hers, and the fire crackled between them, filling the space with heat and light. The wind howled across the mountain, and for a moment the storm outside and the storm inside her chest seemed to merge into one. The world had narrowed to the space between their faces, the rhythm of their breaths, and the undeniable pull that drew them together. And then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of force or desire, but a kiss of recognition, a kiss that spoke of longing and loneliness, of years spent in solitude and the sudden rediscovery of life. She felt her body respond, a warmth spreading from her chest to her limbs, a sensation she had never known and could not name. When he pulled back slightly, his eyes searched hers, asking a question without words, and she found herself leaning into him, pressing her forehead against his. "The spirits have already chosen," he whispered, his voice carrying a certainty that matched the strength in his eyes. She realized in that moment that she no longer wished to return to the life waiting for her at home. The groom, the family obligations, the plans and promises, they felt distant, almost unreal compared to the intensity of what she was experiencing now. The storm raged outside, wind and rain lashing the mountain, but inside their small clearing, the fire burned steadily, and the silence between them was full of understanding and recognition. She had been taken from the Rio Blanco trail against her will. Yet in the presence of the warrior who had not seen a woman in 10 years, she felt a freedom she had never known, a sense of belonging that transcended fear and danger. He did not speak again for long moments, letting the kiss linger in memory and sensation. When he finally moved, it was with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent. "You are not my captive," he said softly, and she understood that his words were not about freedom alone but about choice, respect, and a bond forming between them that could not be denied. The fire crackled, the rain beat against the boughs of the shelter, and the mountains stood silent witnesses to the moment when two lives collided and intertwined. Elena felt a strange courage rise within her, a willingness to trust, to step forward into the unknown, and to face the consequences of her heart. The warrior who had walked alone for 10 years, untouched by human affection, had kissed her, and in doing so had opened a door in both their lives that could never be closed. The storm began to fade, the first light of dawn creeping across the mountain peaks, and yet neither moved from their position by the fire. Their breaths mingled, and the world seemed to hold its breath along with them. The kiss had changed everything, reshaping their fates and the path ahead, and Elena felt a certainty she had never imagined. She was no longer the bride waiting for her family's arrangements. She was part of something larger, something wild and untamed, yet safe and enduring. And the warrior, the man shaped by 10 years of silence, had found a spark in her presence that awakened life, hope, and a connection deeper than words could describe. The mountains, the wind, the fire, and the shadows bore witness to the first step in a story that would carry them through danger, discovery, and ultimately love. Elena pressed her hand to his chest and felt the steady beat of a heart that had known loneliness and longing for too long. And she knew in that instant that the journey they were about to take together was the one neither had expected but both had been waiting for. And though the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, inside there was only warmth, understanding, and the quiet, undeniable certainty of destiny. Asterisk dawn crept slowly over the mountain peaks, pale and soft, touching the pines and cliffs with light that made the shadows retreat but did not lift the tension in the clearing. Elena woke to the sound of distant voices and the metallic click of rifles being cocked, and her heart jumped into her throat. A search party had come, following the trail of the Rio Blanco, carrying the law, her family, and her intended groom who had ridden day and night to find her. The men appeared at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind boulders and trees, guns trained on the warrior who had protected her. "Elena!" The groom shouted, his voice sharp with panic and anger. "Step away from him. You don't know what he's done." She turned her eyes toward the men and felt the pull of old obligations and family ties. But her heart had shifted, her soul had felt the courage of the mountains. And she knew that the life she had been living before this encounter no longer called to her. The warrior stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on her. His hands relaxed at his sides, showing no threat, no aggression, only calm readiness. "If you want to go," he said quietly, his voice low and steady, "go now. They will not kill me if you walk to them." Elena's chest tightened at his words, and a wave of conflict rolled through her. She had once believed her happiness depended on obedience and proper arrangements, on leaving the mountains and returning to the trail of her past life. But now, seeing the search party, feeling the tension in the air, and feeling the solid presence of the warrior, she realized that she had already made a choice her mind had not yet caught up with. Her groom stepped closer, his gun raised slightly, his expression hard and demanding. "Come here." "Now," he commanded. Elena studied the men, their hands trembling, their faces pale, and she understood that they would hesitate, that their commitment to her safety was entwined with fear of harming her. She turned her gaze back to the warrior, whose eyes held hers with a depth of understanding that seemed to measure her very soul. "I'm not going with you," she said softly, her voice carrying more strength than she had ever known it could. Her groom froze, disbelief and anger contorting his face. "Elena, think!" he cried. "Think of your family, of your duty, of what you promised." She met his eyes and shook her head gently. "I have thought," she replied, "and I have chosen." The men exchanged uncertain glances, the tension thick in the morning air. Someone fired a warning shot, the bullet singing past the branches and striking a distant rock, and Elena cried out, moving instinctively to shield the warrior with her own body. "Stop," she shouted. "If you shoot again, you will kill me too." Her voice carried across the clearing, unwavering, and the men hesitated, lowering their weapons as the wind whispered through the pines. Her groom's face turned ashen, and he stepped back, eyes wide, unable to force her from the man who had changed everything. Elena's heart pounded as she looked at the warrior. He had stood motionless, calm and patient, letting her choose freely, letting her take control of her own fate. She realized that in those moments she had already crossed into another world, a world where her choices were her own and not dictated by obligation or fear. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and wet stone, and the clearing felt suspended in time, as though the mountains themselves had paused to witness the act of courage unfolding below their peaks. The warrior stepped closer, his eyes softening as he took her hand in his, not demanding anything, only acknowledging her presence and her choice. She felt the warmth of him, the steady strength of his body, and the unspoken promise that he would protect her in a way that no law or family could. The search party hesitated further, sensing the bond between the two, sensing that the woman they had come to rescue had already been claimed by fate itself. Elena realized that the power of choice, the courage to follow her own heart, and the presence of the warrior who had walked alone for 10 years had shifted the balance. She was no longer a captive of circumstance. She was a participant in her own destiny. The mountains stood silent, the pines swaying in the gentle breeze, as if in approval of the decision she had made. The storm from the night before had cleared, leaving a crisp clarity in the air that matched the clarity she felt in her own heart. She no longer feared the unknown. She embraced it. And though the groom and his party lingered, unsure of what to do, Elena understood that the path she had chosen could not be reversed. She stepped forward, not away from the warrior, but beside him, her hand pressed lightly against his arm. "I am with him," she said, her voice steady and sure. The warrior nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that carried more understanding and respect than any words could. The groom lowered his weapon slowly, a mixture of anger and awe crossing his features. "Elena," he began, but she did not answer. The mountains had claimed her. The warrior had claimed her, and she was no longer bound by the life she had left behind. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as she and the warrior stood together, a silent declaration of allegiance to one another. The men began to retreat, unsure, hesitant, their mission no longer clear, their authority undermined by the undeniable bond between the two. The wind carried away the last echoes of the confrontation, leaving the clearing filled only with the sound of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves. Elena looked at the warrior, his face calm, his eyes steady, and she felt the final weight of fear lift from her chest. She realized that she had crossed from one world into another, a world where love and courage were intertwined, where survival was measured not only in days but in the choices of the heart. The mountains and the wind seemed to approve, and the clearing became their sanctuary, a place where neither past obligations nor future threats could intrude. She pressed her hand to the warrior's chest and felt the strength of his heart, a steady rhythm that had survived years of loneliness, war, and solitude. And in that heartbeat, she understood that she belonged to him and he to her, in a way that the law or her family could never claim. The sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the peaks and the pines. And for the first time since the Rio Blanco trail, Elena felt the freedom of being entirely herself, choosing entirely for herself, and standing entirely with the warrior who had become the center of her world. Together they faced the mountains, the wind, and the unspoken paths of destiny, knowing that their bond was forged not in law or convention but in courage, choice, and the quiet, unbreakable understanding between two hearts that had found one another against all odds. And though the world beyond the clearing still existed, with its towns, families, and expectations, Elena and the warrior existed in this moment and in this place as something more enduring, something shaped by the land, the stars, and the spirit of the wild. The mountains were quiet after the retreat of the search party, their peaks catching the first pale rays of dawn, and the wind carried the crisp scent of pine and stone. Elena stood beside the warrior, her hand resting lightly on his arm, feeling the warmth and strength that had become the anchor of her heart. She had crossed from one world into another, leaving behind the life planned for her, the groom who had tried to claim her, and all the expectations that had once bound her. Now she belonged to this moment, to the mountains, and to the man who had walked alone for 10 years, who had kissed her, protected her, and awakened a part of her she had never known. The warrior, whose name she had learned as Taza, stood tall and steady, his eyes scanning the horizon not for danger, now but as if measuring the world with the presence of someone he no longer wanted to face alone. He turned to her and lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles, a gesture of respect, devotion, and quiet promise. "You chose," he said simply, and the simplicity of his words carried more weight than any elaborate declaration. She nodded, feeling the pulse of her heart in rhythm with his. "I did," she replied softly, her voice certain and unwavering. The fire from the night before had died to embers, yet warmth remained in the clearing, echoing the warmth that spread through her chest. The mountains seemed to embrace them, their silent peaks witnesses to the bond that had formed, a bond forged in choice, courage, and shared solitude. Taza stepped closer, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his fingers lingering lightly on her cheek. "I have walked alone for 10 years, he said, his voice carrying the echo of every battle, every loss, and every lonely night beneath the stars. I closed my heart to every spirit, every hope, every possibility. Until the day you came." Elena felt a shiver of understanding pass through her. She had seen the solitude, the discipline, and the strength he carried. Yet she also saw the man beneath it all, the man who had been waiting for something he did not know he had lost. "And now?" she whispered, leaning slightly closer. "And now," he said, "the path we walk is ours alone. The spirits have chosen, and I will take you as my wife, not by force, but by the will of what has been written for us." She pressed her forehead to his, feeling the strength of his pulse beneath her hand, and a quiet certainty settled over her. The world outside the clearing, the towns, the family, the laws no longer held sway over her. Her heart had chosen, and it had chosen him. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying their approval, and the mountains themselves seemed to acknowledge the union forming beneath the vast sky. Taza lowered his head slowly, and their lips met in a kiss that was gentle yet powerful, a kiss that spoke of love, trust, and the bond of two souls who had been shaped by loss and solitude and had found each other against the odds. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a promise of companionship, and a declaration that the mountains would now witness their life together. Elena felt the strength of his arms as he lifted her slightly, as if the earth itself had conspired to give them this moment. She felt safe, cherished, and wholly alive in a way she had never known before. "You are my wife now," Taza whispered, and the words were not merely a title but a recognition of the spirit, the courage, and the heart that she had offered freely. She smiled against his chest, feeling the warmth and solidity of his presence, and knew that this was where she belonged, where she had been meant to belong all along. The mountains spread around them, silent, enduring, eternal, and the clearing became a sanctuary for two lives bound by choice, love, and the harsh beauty of the West. Their journey would be difficult, the wilderness demanding and unrelenting, yet together they were more than survival. They were life, hope, and devotion intertwined beneath the sky. The river below sparkled in the morning light, the stones and cliffs glowing with the memory of storms and winds, and the wind carried the soft rustle of the pines like a blessing. Elena rested her head against Taza's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the rhythm that had survived years of solitude, and she realized that their union was not merely a joining of bodies but a merging of spirits, of hearts forged by hardship and tempered by time. Taza wrapped his arm around her, pulling her closer, and she felt the power of his presence, the promise of protection, and the depth of devotion that had grown in silence and solitude. They stood in quiet reverence, feeling the earth beneath their feet, the sky above, and the wind that carried their story into the mountains. No law, no family, no past obligations could undo what had been chosen here in this clearing, under the gaze of cliffs that had watched centuries pass. The day stretched before them with endless possibilities, and though danger and uncertainty would always exist in the Wild West, Elena knew that with Taza by her side she would face it with courage, strength, and the certainty of love. They were two lives intertwined, bound by choice and fate, and the mountains, the stars, and the endless skies bore witness to their devotion. The firelight, though faded, seemed to linger in their souls, carrying the warmth, the trials, and the tenderness of the nights they had shared. Taza kissed her once more, gentle and firm, and Elena knew that this was only the beginning of a life that would test them, teach them, and ultimately bind them together in a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. And so, beneath the endless sky and among the cliffs that had shaped their story, the Apache warrior who had not seen a woman in 10 years took Elena as his wife, not with force, not with law, but with the quiet, unyielding authority of destiny, courage, and the hearts of two souls who had found one another in a world that had tried to keep them apart. The wind carried their story across the mountains, the pines whispered it to the peaks, and the river below sang their fate into the land. Elena felt a peace she had never known, a certainty that her choice was her own, and a love that would endure for the rest of her life. Together they stepped into the day, hand in hand, heart in heart, ready to face whatever the Wild West could offer, secure in the knowledge that they belonged to one another and to the mountains that had witnessed their union.